The Public Service Commission and the Moral Regeneration Movement is trying to restore the moral fabric of society. The campaign will be launched through Family Summit under the theme One Family, One Future, Bridging Generations Through Ubuntu. Let's now speak to Professor Somadoda Fikeni, who is the chairperson of the Public Service Commission. Prof, good evening to you and thank you so much for your time. This conversation comes at a time when you have just heard of an 11-year-old boy who was killed in such a brutal manner. Still unclear as to who could have done it, but it would have been a space where he would have expected to be protected.
That is true, Bongi, where thanks for inviting us. What has become true in our engagements with the Moral Regeneration and many other institutions is that we've been focusing on institutions, on education, on everything else in a society whose moral fiber has been shredded. And we have neglected family, which is the basic unit within which morality, within which the very spiritual growth and many other things, values and principles are groomed. And as such, by neglecting that institution, we are not going to succeed at other levels. That's why we felt that family should be brought into the space where it's not just a footnote, but it is at the center because it is a building block for community and it is the building block for society. If you have an integrated community and family, most of these instances of children being killed or being raped or gender-based violence or corruption would go a long way in creating a value-based society. You would go a long way in creating, a society where families are contributing to that stability of the society.
And Prof, it's a welcome intervention, right? But when you take a step back, in 2011, for example, the Green Paper on Families that was presented by the Social Development Department, it put forward proposals on how South African families should be supported in order to flourish and function optimally, also calling for families to play a central role in the national development pursuits of the country and the building of a better South Africa. And then it further quotes, for this ideal to be realized, family life and the strengthening of the family should be promoted in the country. So between 2011 and now, because I'm just speaking about the time when this Green Paper was put out, where then did we lose our way as a country and not implementing what was there then?
One of the biggest challenges that we have as a society is that we confuse development of policies and concepts and conferences with implementation, when in fact we only end up developing these papers, policy positions, one after the other. You may have had an anti-corruption paper somewhere, but corruption became worse. You may have had national development plan, but was not followed. It is precisely that point where we are saying if you develop state capacity, if you professionalize the state, it is the engine, it is the enabler of the state to implement these policies by getting the right people who are competent and having leadership in making sure that policies are not just pronounced on but implemented. It is one of the victims of that particular societal pathology where we develop policies but never see them through.
So is what you're talking about possible? And I ask it in the context of strengthening state capacity. Do we have the climate right now that can allow for such?
It is a perfect climate because we've seen the cost of neglecting state capacity. We've seen corruption becoming worse. We even had the state capture as was investigated and many other instances of corruption. We've seen gender-based violence getting worse. We've seen children disappearing or being killed. We've seen our schools being degraded in many ways. Why? Because some of the most basic policy intentions are never translated into action. And because of that, you've seen the 6th and the 7th administration now embracing the issue of building an ethical capable developmental state, and going further to approve professionalization framework, because we now know the cost of neglecting policies and not implementing them at a personal level, at a state level, at a community level. The society is beginning to rally around efforts to recover and also reset the pattern in society.
Do we really understand the cost? And I ask this, Prof, because if you still have conversations that speak of a fragmented approach, when it comes to dealing with this particular issue, you've got one department here trying to deal with this, but certainly not speaking to the next one. And then both of them are doing things which needed to be at least put together so that they have one streamlined approach. If we're still having that kind of a conversation, do we really as a country understand the cost of what this fragmentation has actually cost the country?
We understand generally, even ordinary citizens, but I do think that the culture within the public service where people work in silos, where they have fiefdoms, some of them have fiefdoms because it's easy to be corrupt when you control your own corner. Hence now society is beginning to say, let's do something, and the professionalization itself is in the process of being implemented. But it won't take the state alone. That's why in the conference tomorrow we're bringing civil society. It will take a social movement from ordinary people who have felt the extremes of this pain into academic institution, into labor, into business sector and government. Gone are the days when you think government alone will solve the problems. Gone are the days when you think the elite, whether business or political, will solve the problems, because some of them, it's the best model when you see fragmentation. So society should begin to own the processes. Churches, mosques, temples should stand up to say, we are claiming this space. As a society, if you go back in our history, whenever we faced the biggest challenge and society was mobilized in its entirety, you have seen when the Freedom Charter was passed in the People's Congress. You have seen when there was a mass democratic movement which forced the government to have transition. You have seen when we faced the World Cup. When society is rallied, this country has an amazing potential. But when you leave only a few and the elite, then only the elite benefits.
So how then do you begin to rally, some in the country? And you mentioned the Freedom Charter, right? And when you go to Kliptown, for example, the contrasting picture when you look at Freedom Square versus what is taking place in Kliptown and the living conditions there. You have some South Africans who say that we're seeing quite a high number of, high levels of crime in the country, substance abuse. There's also, when you look at the fact that there's GBV, some are disillusioned. And they say that when it comes to such arrangements, they only become talk shops. They take it back to this conversation around moral regeneration. It's not a new one in this country. Some say that for them, this is just a talk shop. They certainly don't want to be part of it. So how do you begin to change that particular mindset?
It is those organizing who must start being an example and be serious. It is government departments that we're working with which should be very honest when we're dealing with people, because indeed, I wouldn't blame people for being cynical. I wouldn't blame people for wallowing in the valley of despair, precisely because their lived experience is to be sold a promise after a promise. But we cannot allow a situation where cynicism and despair becomes the default path. We ought to do something. Remember, we've been in this space before, when society, during times of deep crisis, mobilized people and they started working their way out when it was said that the odds are so immense. And it's the same thing. And that's why I'm saying, Bongiwe, people have felt the pain. They've even seen the cliff where they say you'll pay more tax, you'll pay more levies, because we no longer have the money we used to have. Now people realize that There's nothing called government money. It's their own tax that is being used or misused.
Yeah.
And they do know that their own personal security is at stake. That's why you're beginning to see those small at times civil society initiatives and the working together across political lines to say what is at stake here is for the society to work and mobilize its maximum strength to turn the situation around.
So briefly then, before I let you go, what happens beyond tomorrow in order to be able to ensure that this is still put on the national agenda?
It is a follow-up in communities, it's a follow-up in different institutions, but also we are going to insist that when there is a national dialogue, the issue of the family is also put in that particular agenda, because this is a foundational institution in any society that wants to be ethical, that wants to be patriotic. The social engineering of society starts in the families, even before you go to church or school.
Prof, appreciate your time this evening, and let's see then, as you know, this is launched tomorrow, what is, you know, some of the conversations that then are had, especially as you say now that it's time to put the families right back on the national agenda. Appreciate your time this evening. That was Professor Somadoda Fikeni, the chairperson of the Public Service Commission.